Good evening. I'm David Reese, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting of the board. This is the fifth meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Robert Ehrlich.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera.
Present.
Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Sultran.
Present.
David Reese present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The proposed rental adjustments voted at this meeting will be published in the city record and posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, and through the New York City Rules website at http://rules.cityofnewyork.us. Two public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines will be held on the following dates and times. Monday, June 13th, 2022, there will be a public hearing at the Jamaica Performing Arts Center, 153-10 Jamaica Avenue in Jamaica, New York, 11432. It will be held from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. and the public can view the meeting via YouTube feed, but must participate in person. The details will follow. The second hearing is Wednesday, June 15th, 2022. This is also a public hearing. It's at the main theater of Hostos Community College, which is part of CUNY, at 450 Grand Concourse, Bronx, New York, 10451. This hearing will be from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. and the public can view this meeting via YouTube feed, but must participate in person. I will have some more details below. Anyone who wants to comment on the proposed rule at a public hearing must sign up to speak. People wishing to speak at the public hearings can pre-register in advance. Pre-registration of speakers will begin May 23rd at 9 a.m. and is advised. You can pre-register online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, by email at csuperville@nycrgb.org. That's CSUPERVILLE@nycrgb.org. Or you can sign up to speak by calling 212-669-7480. That's 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. For those who do not pre-register, registration is also available at the public hearings. You can register in person from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. on June 13th and from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. on June 15th. If you are unable to attend our hearings, you can submit written, audio, or video comments prior to the hearings for the board members' review starting on May 9th. Instructions to submit these comments will be available on the board's website at nyc.gov/RGB, by email at ask@nycrgb.org, or by calling the RGB at 212-669-7480. That's 212-669-7480. Our next virtual meeting will be May 26th, starting at 9:45 a.m. Information on how to attend this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meeting section in the near future, and at the same time will be sent to those who are on our email list. If you're interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on email updates under quick links. You may also call the board at 212-669-7480. That's 212-669-7480, or email the staff at ask@nycrgb.org for information on how to attend future meetings. The final vote will take place on June 21st, starting at 6:30 p.m. Prior to taking any proposals from the board members, I will first read into the record the proposed language for Hotel Order Number 52 and Apartment and Loft Order Number 54. Proposed Order Number 52, hotels, rooming houses, single-room occupancy buildings, and lodging houses. Rent levels to be effective for leases commencing October 1st, 2022 through September 30th, 2023. Notice is hereby given pursuant to the authority vested in the New York City Rent Guidelines Board by the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 as amended, and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974 as amended, and as implemented by Resolution number 276 of 1974 of the New York City Council, in accordance with the requirements section 1043 of the New York City Charter, that the Rent Guidelines Board hereby proposes the following levels of fair rent increases over lawful rents charged and paid on September 30th, 2022. Applicability. This order shall apply to units and buildings subject to the hotel section of the Rent Stabilization Law, section 26504C and section 26506 of the New York City Administrative Code as amended, or the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, laws of 1974, chapter 576, section 4, subsection 5A7. With respect to any tenant who has no lease or rental agreement, the level of rent increase established herein shall be effective as of 1 year from the date of the tenant's commencing occupancy, or as of 1 year from the date of the last rent adjustment charged to the tenant, or as of October 1st, 2022, whichever is later. This anniversary date will also serve as the effective date for all subsequent Rent Guidelines Board hotel orders, unless the board shall specifically provide otherwise in the order. Where a lease or rental agreement is in effect, this order shall govern the rent increase applicable on or after October 1st, 2022, upon expiration of such lease or rental agreement, but in no event prior to 1 year from the commencement of the expiring lease, unless the parties have contracted to be bound by the effective date of this order. Proposed rent guidelines for hotels, rooming houses, single room occupancy buildings, and lodging houses. Pursuant to its mandate to promulgate rent adjustments for hotel units subject to the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 as amended, section 26-510E of the New York City Administrative Code, the Rent Guidelines Board hereby proposes the following rent adjustments. The allowable level of rent adjustment over the lawful rent actually charged and paid on September 30th, 2022 shall be 1, residential class A, apartment hotels, blank to blank, 2, lodging houses, blank to blank, 3, rooming houses, Class B buildings containing less than 30 units, blank to blank, 4, Class B hotels, blank to blank, 5, single room occupancy buildings, multiple dwelling law, section 248 SROs, blank to blank. Additional charges proposal. It is expressly understood that the rents collectible under the terms of this order are intended to compensate in full for all services provided without extra charge on the statutory date for the particular hotel dwelling unit or at the commencement of the tenancy if subsequent thereto. No additional charges may be made to a tenant for such services. However, such charges may be called or identified. Statement of basis and purpose. The Rent Guidelines Board is authorized to promulgate rent guidelines governing hotel units subject to the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 as amended and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974 as amended. The purpose of these guidelines is to implement the public policy set forth in findings and declaration of emergency of the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969, section 26-501 of the New York City Administrative Code, and in the legislative finding contained in the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, laws of 1974, chapter 576, section 4, subsection 2. Dated May 5th, 2022, to be signed by David Reese, Chair, New York City Rent Guidelines Board. That was the hotel proposed order. Now let me read in the proposed 2022 apartment and loft order number 54. Proposed order number 54, apartments and lofts, rent levels for leases commencing October 1st, 2022 through September 30th, 2023. Notice is hereby given pursuant to the authority vested in the New York City Rent Guidelines Board by the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 as amended and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974 as amended, and is implemented by Resolution number 276 of 1974 of the New York City Council, and in accordance with the requirements of section 1043 of the New York City Charter, that the Rent Guidelines Board, also known as the RGB, hereby proposes the following levels of fair rent increases over lawful rents charged and paid on September 30th, 2022. These rent adjustments will apply to rent stabilized apartments with leases commencing on or after October 1st, 2022 and through September 30th, 2023. Rent guidelines for loft units subject to section 286, subdivision 7 of the multiple dwelling law are also included in this order. Proposed adjustments for leases, apartments. Together with such further adjustments as may be authorized by law, the annual adjustment for leases for apartments shall be for a 1-year lease commencing on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023, blank to blank. For a 2-year lease commencing on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023, blank to blank. These adjustments shall also apply to dwelling units in a structure subject to the partial tax exemption program under Section 421A of the Real Property Tax Law, or in a structure subject to Section 423 of the Real Property Tax Law as a redevelopment project. Proposed adjustments for lofts, units in the category of buildings covered by Article 7C of the Multiple Dwelling Law. The rent guideline proposes the following levels of rent increase above the base rent as defined in Section 286, Subdivision 4 of the Multiple Dwelling Law for units to which these guidelines are applicable in accordance with Article 7C of the Multiple Dwelling Law. For 1-year increases commencing on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023, blank to blank. For 2-year increase periods commencing on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023, blank to blank. Fractional terms, proposal. For the purpose of these guidelines, any lease or tenancy for a period up to and including 1 year shall be deemed a 1-year lease or tenancy, and any lease or tenancy for a period of over 1 year and up to and including 2 years shall be deemed a 2-year lease or tenancy. Escalator clauses, proposal. Where a lease for a dwelling unit in effect on May 31st, 1968, or where a lease in effect on June 30th, 1974 for a dwelling unit which became subject to the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 by virtue of the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974 and Resolution number 276 of the New York City Council contained an escalator clause for the increased costs of operation, and such clause is still in effect. The lawful rent on September 30th, 2022, over which the fair rent under this order is computed, shall include the increased rental, if any, due under such clause, except those charges which accrue within 1 year of the commencement of the renewal lease. Moreover, where a lease contained an escalator clause that the owner may validly renew under the code, unless the owner elects or has elected in writing to delete such clause, effective no later than October 1st, 2022, from the existing lease and all subsequent leases for such dwelling unit. The increased rental, if any, due under such escalator clause shall be offset against the amount of increase authorized under this order. Special adjustments under prior orders, proposal. All rent adjustments lawfully implemented and maintained under previous apartment orders and included in the base rent in effect on September 30th, 2022 shall continue to be included in the base rent for the purpose of computing subsequent rent adjusted pursuant to this order. Proposed special guideline. Under Section 26-513B1 of the New York City Administrative Code and Section 9E of the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, the Rent Guidelines Board is obligated to promulgate special guidelines to aid the State Division of Housing and Community Renewal in its determination of initial legal regulated rents for housing accommodations previously subject to the City Rent and Rehabilitation Law, which are the subject of a tenant application for adjustment. The Rent Guidelines Board hereby proposes the following special guidelines. For dwelling units subject to the Rent and Rehabilitation Law on September 30th, 2022, which became vacant after September 30th, 2022, the special guideline shall be blank. Decontrolled units, proposal. The permissible increase for decontrolled units as referenced in Order 3A, which became decontrolled after September 30th, 2022, shall be blank. Credits, proposal. Rentals charged and paid in excess of the levels of rent increase established by this order shall be fully credited against the next month's rent. Statement of basis and purpose. The Rent Guidelines Board is authorized to promulgate rent guidelines governing apartment units subject to the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969 as amended and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974 as amended. The purpose of these guidelines is to implement the public policy set forth in Findings and Declaration of Emergency of the Rent Stabilization Law of 1969, Section 26-501 of the New York City Administrative Code, and in the legislative finding contained in the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, Laws of 1974, Chapter 576, Section 4, Subsection 2. The Rent Guidelines Board is also authorized to promulgate rent guidelines for loft units subject to Section 286, Subdivision 7 of the Multiple Dwelling Law. The purpose of the loft guidelines is to implement the public policy set forth in the legislative findings of Article 7C of the Multiple Dwelling Law, Section 280. This is to be dated May 5th, 2022, and signed by David Reese, Chair, New York City Rent Guidelines Board. It has become an RGB tradition to allow tenant and owner members to make proposals first before we take motions from the public members. Last year, owner members presented their proposal first, so this year we will hear from the tenant members first. As per our agenda, the board will be considering proposals for Hotel Order 52 first. Do the tenant members, would they like to make a motion?
So, David, you're not, okay, I can make a motion for the hotel.
Okay, great, Shayla. Please go ahead.
Let me pull up text. I mean, I think this board is acknowledged that hotels, rent stabilized hotels are very profitable. There are also very few little tenants who would qualify or consider themselves rent stabilized tenant in a hotel building. I think that recognition by this board acknowledges that one, we're losing rent stabilization at a really high rate. We don't want what's happened already to hotels to happen to rent stabilization, which is why we also call for rent freeze and rent rollbacks for apartments. And on that note, should I just read the text, David?
Sure.
At this time, I would like to put forward the motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent stabilized hotel units. I move to adopt the language proposed Hotel Order 52 as read into the record at this meeting, and I move to adopt the following rental adjustments for rent stabilized hotels. Residential Class A, 0%. Lodging houses, 0%. Rooming houses, 0%. Class B hotels, 0%. Single room occupancy buildings, 0%. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustment proposed and the proposed language of the order.
Thank you, Shayla. Is there a second for Shayla's motion?
I second.
A second from Adon. So just to summarize Shayla's motion, for the hotel order, it's zeros for all categories. Is there any discussion on the motion?
Just want to say out loud that the fact that there is no discussion is not what we want to happen to rent stabilization as a whole. That there is no discussion because owners know that this is a profitable business for hotels, as most of the owners in rent stabilized apartments. And this is what we should be doing as a whole for all rent stabilized housing in the city.
Is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. I'm just going to get my sheet so that I can keep track of it more carefully. So just bear with me for a second. So the motion is proposed by Shayla, seconded by Adon, with zeros all the way down. And I will do a roll call vote. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
Yes.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
No.
Shayla Garcia, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
Yes.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
Yes.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
No.
Adon Sultran, how do you vote?
Yes.
And David Reese, I vote yes. The motion passes 7-2 with no abstentions. Okay, thank you all. Let me just get to where I need to get to on my screen. We will now consider motions for proposed apartment and loft order number 54. Tenant members will get the first opportunity for a motion, followed by the owner members. Do I have a motion from the tenant members?
Yes, Adan will get us started.
Thank you.
So I think this year we're actually going to give a joint statement between myself and Shayla prior to putting forth our motion.
Woo!
Good evening to the members of the public, fellow board members, staff of the RGB, and the tenants of the city that we love. Before I begin, I want to thank and acknowledge the wonderful advocates of the Rent Justice Coalition and the tenants participating in the watch parties at Housing Conservation Coordinators in CASA tonight. I wish I could be there with you, but I recently tested positive this morning for COVID. I'm joining the hearing today from my rent-stabilized apartment in quarantine because I understand how vitally important today's hearing is to the future of affordable rent-stabilized housing in the city. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Adan Sotren, and I am a tenant representative and the newest member of the Rent Guidelines Board. For the last 7.5 years, I've worked as an attorney with the Housing Justice Unit Group Advocacy Project of the Legal Aid Society, fighting to assert the rights of low-income, predominantly Black and Brown groups of tenants in housing court. In conjunction with the wonderful work of my colleagues of the Harlem Community Law Office's Tenant Defense Unit, my unit specializes in suing landlords to make repairs, provide essential services, cease harassment, in addition to litigating overcharge complaints, cases of illegal deregulation, and challenging the legitimacy of MCIs and IAIs, among other things. Prior to my time at Legal Aid, I practiced immigration law and removal, deportation, defense. As the newest member on this board, I must admit that the process of this year has been a bit of a whirlwind. And in preparation for my service on the board, I went back to the rent stabilization law to fully understand the mandate of the City Council when they created the RGB. This is what the language of the statute reads. Action is necessary in order to prevent exactions of unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive rents and rental agreements, and to forestall profiteering, speculation, and other disruptive practices tending to produce threats to the public health, safety, and general welfare. It goes on to say that this is because many owners, and I quote, were demanding exorbitant and unconscionable rent increases. These are the underpinnings of why the RGB exists. It is to preserve and protect affordable housing in our city, not to preserve annual profits for landlords or to make them whole. For the last 30 years, owners, both large and small, have realized unchecked profits for decades, and in total, over a 40% increase in net operating income. This doesn't even reflect the increase in value and profitability of their properties. Yet here we are today, battling against a tide of advocates relying on conflated data so that this year, the first in the last 15 years, when we see a dip in net operating income, all of a sudden it appears as though the words of the statute are thrown to the wind. The Rent Guideline Board's main task is to make rental adjustments, not increases, to maintain affordability, even if that translates to lower profit margins for owners. Often in the last several weeks, it became apparent to me that the approach to these issues and the framing is simply flawed. This board appears to operate under a false premise that landlords deserve to have NOI increase consistently and that anything less is unfair or unjust. To that end, we combed through comprehensive detailed reports on landlords' alleged costs, expenses, and effects of inflation while arguing over how much to increase rent in order to keep them whole. But no such meaningful analysis occurs for tenants. Attempts at projecting how to keep tenants whole is non-existent, while arguments regarding affordability and the numerous crises facing tenants are given short shrift.
Thanks, Adan. This is my 9th year on the board. It is sad that I didn't have to change much of my speech from 2016. Tenants are still struggling to survive. Landlords of rent-regulated buildings have been making record profits. Many public members and landlords pretend this isn't true. Let's look at our own data. On page 3, the income and affordability study, our own report says between 2019 to 2020, net operating income fell 7.8% for buildings containing rent stabilized units. The 4th decrease in the last 30 years. It's only decreased 4 times in 30 years.
Oh my.
Let's have that sit with us for a second. That means in 26 years, NOI has increased. Rent stabilization has been profitable and just fine. Let me repeat that when we're voting on rent increases because NOI fell, why didn't we do that when NOI was rising and roll back rents and make sure that tenants could afford their apartments? Let's step away from what the owners say, their profit is not happening, and speak about the lucrative and stable investment rent stabilization is. Owners bought 777 buildings in 2021. That means in the height of a pandemic, they were buying properties. That means that they saw this as a lucrative investment. I'm sorry, I lost my track. In the staff income and affordability study, you would think that tenants are doing just great. According to them, the average real wages fell 9.3% from 2020, following an increase of 1.6% in the prior year in real wages. Let's just hear out the income that they're going to talk about. The incomes that rose from $97,000 to $256,000 a year in 2020. Who here makes that income in a year?
Not me.
Nobody. But let's look at the year 2020. They're saying your income rose from $97,000 a year to $106,000 a year. It isn't until we read on that it says, only in one sector did we see New York City saw a decline of real wages during 2020. Accommodation and food services, which fell 4.8%. Are those the jobs that tenants have?
No, we're poor.
The CCS testimony this year said the Rent Guidelines Board enacts, I'm going to skip that. That the New Yorkers earning below 200% of the federal poverty line are making about $43,000 a year for a family of three.
That ain't true.
According to the 2017 HVS, 365 low-income households live in rent-stabilized housing. That's roughly double the number of those living in public and subsidized housing combined. 76% of them identify as Black, Hispanic, and Asian. Nearly half are immigrant households. Rent-stabilized households are likely female-headed, include senior citizens, more than in unregulated housing. How are we okay increasing rents when 26% of people living in the rent stabilized housing that we're proposing to increase them pay more than 50% of their income in rent? That's 50% of their income in rent, 26%. When you come to the Bronx, where I'm sitting here with tenants, that's 33%. 33% of all households are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. Not only isn't right, but people talk about 3% rent increase like it's nothing. And we know that's not true.
We're break burdened already.
It's the people behind me right now who are impacted by our decisions. And let's not gloss over the homelessness numbers that the report does gloss over by saying evictions were down 95% when we know that there was a moratorium that we fought for. We fought for everyone in this room, making lobby visits, calling their electeds and telling them to stop evictions in New York. Let's not ignore the fact that there are 200,000 pending evictions in New York City right now. How many tenants in the room know someone who is going paycheck to paycheck right now? Raise your hand.
I do.
How many know someone who's making a decision on buying food or paying for medication?
I do. buying food or paying.
How many of us took a break during the biggest pandemic in 100 years for our mental health?
I do.
And now we're having a conversation, not only about what is happening in the city as these people are not impacted by your decision, but we're only having 2 hearings, not 5, so that we are more accessible to most folks. And we should make sure that we provide interpretation in any language that is needed and necessary. I also want to push the board to remember that some of us are still having to quarantine, that some of us are still struggling, and to have a Zoom option for those who can't join us in person to participate. Most folks identify as a tenant. I'm going to use a tenant that I know. I changed her initial to. An amazing woman who I would refer to by S. She has 3 kids, 2 of them who are in college. She is struggling to get back to work and pay her $1,700 a month rent in the Bronx. She is still unemployed and cannot survive just taking a job at minimum wage. Let me make a picture of what would happen if this mother of 3 took a minimum wage job. In a day, she would make $105 a day. That's before taxes. One of the owners in one of the invited testimonies earlier in this year mentioned that an IAI increase is only $89. That's 1 full days of work for a single mom with 3 kids. Let's put that into perspective. She would be making $300 to $525 a week, $2,100 a month. And let's remember, her rent is $1,700 a month. That's 80% of her income if she paid that in full. That doesn't include $127 for a Metro card for her to get to work, or even if she bought it on a weekly basis, $33 a week. That doesn't include the average expense for food. So we just assume that this mother, the single mother of 3, will just not eat and not travel and only pay rent because that's the only thing that she's impacted by. According to numbeo.com, people in New York City spend an average of $486 a month on food per person. That is $100 more than the national average. So when we talk about inflation, when we talk about the impact of what the economic crisis means for people, we are talking about people who are deciding whether to eat healthy, to travel to work, or to be able to spend time with their kids without working 2 or 3 jobs. This tenant is like many thousands of people across the city, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, as we heard earlier in the city. I hear you. I see your struggle. I will not turn away from that struggle. This will impact most of the people behind me, and we will not put profits over people. We will center you as we continue to advocate and fight for you. I'll turn it over to Adan.
Even with the data, thank you, Shayla. Even with the data that Shayla has highlighted, much of the information that could be used to potentially paint a more complete picture of the struggles of rent-stabilized tenants either has not been compiled or is unavailable prior to this preliminary vote. Further, the commensurate adjustment guidelines this year, which the press and the owner advocates jumped on early to set unconscionable ranges for increases, has no counterpart from the tenant perspective. There is no commensurate adjustment report for the struggling tenant whose cost of living continues to skyrocket. At a bare minimum, we should be working to create a projection that would allow us to understand what annual rent adjustments would be needed to make rent-stabilized tenants whole. What I also found appalling in this process was that rather than acknowledge that for years during the Giuliani and Bloomberg eras, when we knew that landlords were still doing well in terms of the data and were realizing sizable profits, this board still raised the rents for tenants. Now, in a series of years that could arguably be the toughest for tenants in decades, this board may again choose owner profits over people. Let's look at a little bit of context this year. The pandemic is not over. New York City is faced with the second highest unemployment rate since 1993. There's over 220,000 eviction cases that are currently pending in housing court. Public interest legal services providers that help stave off evictions are overwhelmed and short-staffed. There's a raging homelessness crisis that's persisting, and the cost of food and goods are projected to increase another 3 to 4% within the next 6 months. Yet tenants are being told anyone can handle a small increase, and if not, the social safety net will catch you. This thinking shows me that folks are either out of touch with the reality of the struggles of low-income and working-class rent-stabilized New Yorkers, much of whom are predominantly Black and Latinx, or worse, they knowingly and intentionally intend to squeeze our communities to displace and replace them. The last point I'd like to make before sharing our proposal addresses the narrative being peddled by owners that if this board gives another rent freeze, owners will not generate enough income to properly maintain their buildings and that the rent-stabilized housing stock will fall into ruin. Just so we're operating all from the same understanding, buildings with the vast majority of rent-stabilized units were and are continuing to fall into disrepair. So when owners complain about increased costs, debt service, when in reality, they're taking advantage of cash out refinancing and avoiding reinvesting in their buildings, who are we to believe? The same people who are talking about the passage of the draconian and nefarious HSTPA in 2019 as if it were the monster lurking under their bed at night, when in reality, that was a response to decades and decades of abuse, deregulation, displacement, and profiteering? Or should we believe my neighbor down the block who has a hole in his apartment so wide he can see into the basement? Or my client who lives in an apartment with his wife and 2 asthmatic sons with mold and literal mushrooms hanging from his bathroom ceiling? Or perhaps my other client who was literally on the phone with me complaining about his cooking gas being shut off when the superintendent intentionally cut off his electricity. We may never get owners to open up the books and show where the money from their cash out financing practices go. But those of us on this side of the table know where it's not going because we see it, we live it. It's not going to helping the people of the city. It's not going back into our communities. So when all of us go home tonight and we unwind from this long day, let's remember that not a single member on this board lives check to check. No one in here is a step away from eviction or a homelessness shelter. You haven't been threatened with retribution by your landlord or told that they will call ICE on you for complaining about your electricity being cut off. You haven't had your kids repeatedly taken to the doctor for mice bites and issues with bed bugs. Those are the realities for a large number of people living in rent-stabilized housing. The votes that you cast here tonight and a month from now will either affect the ability of the thousands of people to survive in this city or to affect a select group's bank accounts. Thank you. At this time, I would like to put forward a motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized apartments and lofts. I move to adopt the language of the proposed apartment and loft order number 54 as read into the record at this meeting, and I move to adopt the following proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized apartments and lofts. For apartments, 1-year lease, the range being -1% to 1%. For 2-year lease, 0% to 1.5%. For lofts, 1-year increase period of -1% to 1%. For 2-year increase period, 0 to 1.5%. For special guidelines, 27% above the maximum base rent. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments I propose and the proposed language of the order.
Thank you, Adon. Is there a second for Adon's motion?
I second it.
A second from Sheila. So just to summarize, Adon's motion is for apartments and lofts, -1 to 1% for 1 year and 0 to 1.5% for 2 years, with a special guideline of 27% above maximum base rent. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. And I'll take a roll call vote. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
No.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
No.
Sheila Garcia, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
Yes.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
No.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
No.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
No.
Adon Soltran, how do you vote?
Yes.
David Reese, chair, votes no. The motion fails by a vote of 3-6 with no abstentions. Okay, let me turn to the owner members. Do you have a motion?
Yes, we do, David. I'm going to start off by giving a statement, and then
Okay.
we'll present as well. Good evening. Christina Smith and I, as the landlord representatives, would like to take a moment to thank the Rent Guidelines Board for their hard work all year. Chairman Reese, fellow board members, thank you for considering our preliminary vote proposal for release adjustment ranges for rent stabilized apartments in 2022 and 2023. Inflation is hurting property owners as the cost of providing safe, clean, affordable housing continues to rise. Our analysis of the data is that an increase of rents that keeps up with inflation and rising property taxes is necessary to protect the housing stock. The RGB research tells us that roughly 1/3 of rent stabilized buildings are spending more than 70% of their operating income on costs that the RGB tracks. These buildings are functionally bankrupt if they have responsible mortgages that are about 25% of their income, and they are compliant with unfunded mandates and other capital expenses required by New York City laws, which are not captured in the PIOC and subsequent NOI calculations. All indications are that these buildings are in a downward trend towards insolvency, unless the board approves increases that keep up with the costs. Some of our colleagues have tried to argue that concerns over long-term viability of the housing stock can be dismissed by focusing on the core of Manhattan. While we agree that wealthy zip codes in Manhattan distort the data, we think it is a folly to suggest that massive plunge in net operating income can simply be credited to what happened in the core of Manhattan during the pandemic. The data for the areas outside of the core of Manhattan is equally as troubling. Buildings didn't suffer declines as dramatic in operating income, but they did suffer declines. And there is no reason to think these buildings will bounce back. While rents have rebounded in core Manhattan and select areas of Brooklyn, these rent increases have been focused on the upper bands of rent levels in free market apartments, not in the stabilized housing stock. Stabilized rents in upper Manhattan and the outer boroughs have yet to see material increases. This is attributable to the passage of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which has eliminated all mechanisms to increase revenue outside of what this board does. Housing has costs. We need to make sure that buildings have the money to pay for those costs. If we don't get this right, a large number of buildings could very quickly slip into dilapidation. We could return to the horrifying days of the 70s and 80s very quickly. If we choose to authorize a rent increase that does not keep up with inflation and other costs, then we as a board are choosing to decommodify housing. Inflation is currently over 6%. It is expected to rise when the latest reports come out next week. Property tax assessments on most of the rent stabilized housing stock have also gone up, some astronomically. So as the city tries to combat rising costs from inflation by increasing the revenue needed. I'm going to turn over to Christina now.
Thanks, Rob. Yesterday, the Federal Reserve dramatically raised interest rates and signaled that they'll continue to do so further to combat inflation, which means building owners will end up paying more money for their mortgages when they refinance, leaving them with less money to safely maintain their properties and the homes of their tenants. Energy prices are likely to be much higher than what the PIOC predicts, the data that the board supports. Its methodology is sound in regular times, normal times, but we're living in an era when costs are skyrocketing post-pandemic, and there are severe supply issues due to the war in Ukraine. Furthermore, there is legislation in the City Council to dramatically increase the minimum temperature of buildings, which, if passed, will significantly increase the cost of heating stabilized properties. The state is also pushing for the rapid electrification of buildings, which comes with massive capital costs. All of this makes it hard to believe that fuel prices are going to go down next year. Another cost that is not captured fully in our reports is the cost of water. And next week, the Water Board is implementing a 4.9% increase. This on top of a 2.7% increase last year. The income and expense reports will not capture those costs until next year and the following year, yet we know that they are coming. We need to authorize a rent increase that keeps up with these costs, so housing providers have the ability to maintain their buildings and make sure that the buildings are safe. For this reason, we propose, Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this.
Yep.
Well, okay, I'm going to jump in on the proposal. I'll jump in on the proposal when we finish. You want to do the last?
Yeah, sure. These ranges that Rob will propose will not put a dime more of profit in housing providers' pockets. The NOI is not profit. That needs to be reiterated. Considering how volatile inflation is, it likely will not even offset rising costs. These adjustments are simply minimum to make sure stabilized properties in the city continue to be safe for renters, and some direct data on heating costs. A 35-unit building that's burning heating fuel for heat and hot water, the costs are up 144% year over year. And the average annual cost on a building of that size is $168,000 a year. If anyone, members of the board or anyone listening, has had to heat their own homes, you know how heating costs, the cost to heat a home, an apartment, water, up tremendously. For all these reasons, Rob's proposal and proposed increases make the most sense to keep the housing stock in good condition going forward.
And at this time, I would like to put forward a motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent stabilized apartments and lofts. I move to adopt the language of the proposed apartment and loft order number 54 as read into the record of this meeting. And I move to adopt the following proposed rental adjustments for rent stabilized apartments and lofts. Apartments, 1-year lease, a range of 4.5 to 6.5%. 2-year lease, a range of 6.5 to 8.5%. Lofts, 1-year increase period, a range of 4.5 to 6.5%. 2-year increase period, a range of 6.5 to 8.5%. Special guideline, 27% above maximum base rent. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments I propose and the proposed language of the order. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Is there a second for Rob's motion?
Second.
The second by Christina. So just to restate the motion, for apartments and lofts, 1-year range of 4.5% to 6.5%, and 2-year range of 6.5% to 8.5%, with a special guideline of 27% above maximum base rent. Is there any discussion? I'm sorry, did I get that wrong, Rob?
No, that's correct. I was just confirming that.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, sorry.
Write it off for your tax.
So I am gonna I just want to respond to some of the comments made earlier. If you want to talk about inflation, I just want you to go to a grocery store and see what it means to feed a family right now. Landlords can cut some corners and say, I'm not going to replace that bucket this year. Tenants cannot decide not to feed their kids. I think the other piece is that, you know, there are some wins that tenants have been fighting for a long time, like the minimum temperature in an apartment. Many of the tenants behind me have to call 311 to talk about heat. They don't have adequate heat. Their heat gets turned off in the middle of the night. Landlords skimp already. We don't need to increase rents just because of that. I think the other piece that I wanted to just highlight is that if we are not talking about NOI as profits, let's just have landlords open their books. When you talk about safety nets, when you say tenants can apply for a one-shot deal, they can apply for ERAP. They have to bear it all. They have to show their income. They have to talk about their households and their bills. Landlords don't have to do that. So if we want to talk about reality of what landlords are experiencing, have them open up their books, and then I'll start to feel bad for them.
And any further discussion on the motion? Hearing, yep, Christina, yes?
No.
No, I'm sorry. Okay, hearing none, I call the question. I'll do a roll call vote. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
No.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sheila Garcia, how do you vote?
Definitely not. Definitely no.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
No.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
No.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
No.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
Yes.
Adon Soltrin, how do you vote?
No.
David Reese votes no. The motion fails by a vote of 2-7 with no abstentions. Sorry, I'm just getting my papers in place. Give me a second. At this time, I would like to put forward a motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent stabilized apartments and lofts. Before I do so, I just wanted to remind the members of the board and the public that these are preliminary guideline adjustments. I encourage that the public join in our annual process of public comment, and I look forward to reading and listening to your comments. I move to adopt the language of the proposed apartment and loft order number 54 as read into the record at this meeting, and I move to adopt the following proposed rental adjustments for rent stabilized apartments and lofts. Apartments, 1-year lease, a range of 2% to 4%. 2-year lease, a range of 4% to 6%. Lofts, 1-year increase period, a range of 2 to 4%. 2-year increase period, a range of 4 to 6%. The special guideline, 27% above the maximum base rent. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments I proposed and the proposed language of the order. Is there a second for my motion?
Second.
Second by Alex. Okay, so just to reiterate, for 1-year leases and lofts, a range of 2 to 4%. For 2-year leases and lofts, a range of 4 to 6%, with a special guideline 27% above the maximum base rent. Is there any discussion of the motion?
I just want to make sure that like the sentiment in this room is heard on the board.
We coming to live with you.
People are suggesting that maybe when they get evicted, they can come and live with some of the board members who are proposing these increases. Because those 2% at the minimum would be devastating to most of the folks in this room.
Is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. I'll take a roll call vote. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
Yes.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
No.
Sheila Garcia, how do you vote?
No.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
Yes.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
Yes.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
No.
Adon Soltrin, how do you vote?
No.
David Reese votes yes. The motion passes by a vote of 5 to 4 with no abstentions. Okay. Okay, that concludes the business of our agenda and the business of today's meeting. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
A motion to adjourn by Christina Smith, and do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Robert Ehrlich. I look forward to seeing all of the board members and the board staff at our next meeting on May 26th. Thank you for your service to this board.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Hi, everyone. Bye-bye.